And with a week of big news developments in Nigeria and beyond, which ones have our analysts catching their breath or out of breath? Which helped them regain or save their breath, and which left them with bated breath? Well, the breath flew out of many Nigerians when this week they heard that yet another plane belonging to this country had been seized by that Chinese firm known as Zhongzhan, this time in Canada, following the ones they had already impounded in France, as well as Nigerian government property seized in the UK for a breach of contract. What salutary lessons are there in the fact that the Chinese will go to extreme lengths to protect their agreements? And in a week in which the hunger protests across Nigeria were still resonating with demands for good governance, it also turned out to be a year this week since President Tinubu inaugurated his cabinet of 45 ministers, charging them to transform this country with the promise of his renewed hope agenda. So how do we assess their performance? And as we look back at the week that was, we also look back at the people's constitution that never was and ask if it will ever be. In a country shaken by ethnic divisions and a growing sense of alienation from the state, where is this latest push for fundamental constitutional reform heading? Or perhaps nowhere at all. And on the international scene, a moment this week that many people did not envisage just a month ago. America's lesser-known second-in-command now propelled into the starring role. But can Kamala Harris make history by becoming the first woman to be President of the United States? Well, let's get the perspectives of our guest analysts on this and the other news and issues of the week. Hopefully, they'll help us understand better what's going on in the headlines and behind the headlines. And they are Donu Kogbara, an international multimedia journalist who once worked for the BBC in London. She currently has a column with Vanguard newspaper, presents a YouTube program called Donu's World, co-presents a podcast called Africa Here and Now, and writes for the European magazine called The Africa Report. Baba Yusuf, a policy strategist and group CEO of the Global Investment and Trade Company, who's also a special economic zones expert and was the first MD and CEO of the first airport free trade zone in Nigeria. And in our off-site studio, Kenny Okolugbo, who is a current affairs analyst, a political and communications consultant, and a former commissioner in Delta State. Lady and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. And let me come to you first, Donu. We are right. Okay, we've got boxes, and that's important to keep in mind. Let me come to you first, Donu, and let's start with the fact that this week we recorded a year since the 45 cabinet ministers, President Tinubu's cabinet ministers, were inaugurated. Does it now seem a bit of a stretch after 1 year as ministers that Mr. Tinubu's cabinet were portraying themselves as the ministers of change, or have they met your expectations?
Well, I think we can safely say that they have not met anybody's expectations except someone who is a sycophant or delusional. Now, it may not entirely be their fault. I don't know the constraints they're working under. One or two of them are my personal friends, and I have a lot of hope that they will get to perform adequately. But quite frankly, the protests that took place recently say it all, really. Nigerians are not happy. Just because old cargoes like me didn't hit the streets with placards doesn't mean to say that all the recent discontent is purely, the preserve of irresponsible young people or, Peter Obi supporters. Everybody I know, almost everybody, is fed up.
And let me come to you, Baba Yusuf. have their promises of change and renewed hope manifested in any clearly discernible way in terms of measurable development? I mean, kitchen table issues that people care about?
To be honest, the evaluation of the performance of this administration is very clear, if I will add to what Donu mentioned with regards to the protest. Another clear validation of the abysmal performance, Charles, are the socio-economic indices. They speak to us, they stare at us in the face. The galloping core headline and food inflation, issues with regards to foreign policies and engagements, outcomes of which we are going to discuss during this interim discussions. And also, more fundamentally, Charles, the poor people of this country, over almost 60% of Nigerians that are declared multidimensionally poor, are crying and cringing and dying and wallowing in abject poverty, crying out. And to make it worse, you have handlers of Mr. President and spokespersons living in denial and even insulting these people by telling them that they are oppositions. So these are the issues we have on the table. We have clashes of policies, policy incoherences that have made Mr. President to have to revise some decisions with adverse consequences on the momentum of the administration, if you like. So to a large extent, there is need for Mr. President to go back to the drawing table, very critical, review the situation, do impact assessment, objective and frank, and now decide how to move forward going forward.
So clearly you haven't seen anything with a huge amount of flesh on it coming from those ministers. And let me just make clear, so you don't sound like a broken record, that what we're talking about is 1 year since the cabinet of President Tinubu was inaugurated. I mean, that obviously came after President Tinubu had been sworn in May of last year. Let me come to you, Kenny Okolugbo, in our off-site studio. Thank you for your patience. It's a year, as you might have heard from us this week, since President Tinubu inaugurated his cabinet of 45 ministers. He gave them the remit of the renewed hope agenda. How do you assess their performance so far? Do you think they've delivered or under-delivered?
Well, I wouldn't like to say it's all been negative. There are some ministers that have delivered, so let's try to make it clear. If you look at the Minister of the FCT, the Minister of Works, you wouldn't say they have under-delivered. Yes, there's still a lot of work to be done on our roads, which is not in doubt, but we have seen some specifics from these two ministers. I'm using them as a point of contact to assessing the other ministers. But if you're talking about 45 cabinet ministers, and we are actually picking on 2, 3, 4, 5, it shows that the president still needs to do an assessment of the ministers he has. But it has not been that negative, as was said. Yes, in terms of inflation, the numbers are not good. We just dropped from 34% to 33%. Everybody wants to be desirous of having a single-digit inflation. Everybody wants to see that the prices of food and goods in the market actually would come to a sharp decrease from what we have presently. But the policies that were put in place were certainly one that needed time, because if you actually float your currency and you remove subsidy, which was not provided for in June 2023, it was not unexpected that we're going to have the situation we have. But how the situation is going to be managed is exactly what we need to face the reality of it. But I still think that because of the policies that came in with this government and because of the 8 years of economic underdevelopment that we did experience, I still believe that the government still needs time. Yes, I feel the pain of my colleagues in the other side of the studio, but it hasn't been a total negative for the ministers. I beg to disagree.
So basically, in a nutshell, Kenny is saying that they haven't completely delivered, but they haven't under-delivered. Let me come to you, Donu. If you were to break it down to scopes or scores, let me put it that way, in the different ministries or sectors, which would you score high and which would you score low?
I was actually tempted to say in the first place that I think Wike, the governor for FCT, has performed pretty well in terms of infrastructural development. But I thought people would think I was biased because he used to be my governor. And also I have to say that roads are great, but we're talking about human and social factors now. And I wouldn't say FCT has been, has delivered. People here are hungry. People here are desperate. I have never before come across so many people who would not normally bother me, because there's a view that poor people have no dignity. Actually, a lot of them do. And there are lots of them who wouldn't ask you for anything unless they were desperate. In the past week, 7 people have said to me things like, please, can I have 5,000 naira? My mother hasn't eaten since yesterday. So I'd say FCT, great on infrastructure, perhaps now needs to turn more towards the social and development factors. And I totally disagree about the Minister of Works.
Right. How so?
Rude, crude.
That doesn't mean he's not delivering, though.
Well, I just think that the whole debacle of that road in Lagos and the way he's handled appeals for discussions about the due process around that contract, I just think there's really no need to be so unpleasant. This is a democracy. If people ask you questions, please answer them intelligently. You don't need to put people down just because they want to get a rationale.
Yeah, indeed. Baba Yusuf, obviously you've heard both Kenny and Donu there. Based on a broad assessment, and we haven't done anything forensic basically on the work that the ministers have done, but based on a broad assessment, do you think that based on their performance, calls for a cabinet reshuffle are justified or not?
Thank you for that very nice strategic question. To respond to the point, if you have to start struggling to identify 2-star ministers, what you call champion in a cabinet of 45, and you just do a rule of thumb of 2 over 45, that's a failure, Charles. And if you identify the stars and you see a subnational performer addressing the issues of FCT, whereas you have critical sectors that are supposed to have an omnibus national critical impacts like defense, okay, like internal affairs, like other transport and other critical sectors that are supposed to quickly turn around the economy that has been taken over on the needs. That should be the focus of the administration. So by and large, I struggle to identify champions, but I know there are superstars who have made their mark in their own right. However, performance is measured by outcomes and impacts, not by events. That being said, I believe with the high level of expectations on President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, based on his antecedents and the promise he made to Nigerians himself, asserting that we should not have sympathy for him, he could deliver. Those expectations are high, and then the outcomes that are not coming, to my mind, is my premise of this assessment going forward. So therefore, there is need to really do a lot. Maybe a cabinet reshufflement will put round pegs in round holes, or maybe an overhaul, because I think 1 year is enough in any setting, especially a war room setting like this, critical setting, for some people to be shown the way out, because clearly they don't have the capacity to operate at that level, because at the level of appointment, a lot of political considerations were made, and that is why they are sitting on their hands, and there's issue of even corruption in some cases. Mr. President is moving with lead-made shoes or iron-made shoes. He cannot run with this. He needs to review this situation.
Very interesting assessments there, and I'm afraid we're going to have to move on because we've got a lot of other topics to get to, but thank you all of you for that so far. I don't know whether any of you saw that spirited debate on this program on Wednesday between the lawyer and good governance advocate, activist Deji Adeyanju, and the lawyer and pro-Tinubu public policy analyst Daniel Buwala about the merits and demerits of those end bad governance protests that took place 2 weeks ago. I mean, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but let's just listen to a clip from that program that we had here, I believe, on Wednesday.
The protest, if it were a spontaneous protest, you would say there would have been no need for identifiable leadership because it's spontaneous. This was a well-planned and organized protest. Certain individuals gave a date, produced demands, shared it, gave timelines, talk about where to meet, and that there are human beings planning it. The government said, can you come, let's have a talk. Unfortunately for them and to their disadvantage, they refused to come up. So after they exhausted the 10 days now, there is nothing they can point at and say, we're going to hold government responsible on A, B, and C. And my point is, if they had secured representation, where you come to the president and say it, you see, the idea of coming to meet with the government is so the government who can tell you from what you're demanding, what can be, what cannot be, what requires time, and you can have an understanding.
This is not the first time protesters are protesting and having demand. Do you meet a government that is not willing, not ready to negotiate? You know, that, because look at the amount of resource that was put into stopping this protest. Imagine we just put that energy into fixing the country. Look at, we never knew until the End Bad Governance protest that we have this amount of security mobilization in the country. That means we can actually tackle the insecurity problem in the country if we want. It simply means some people in somewhere do not want the insecurity problem in the country to be solved. Because here in the FCT, the police said they deployed over 4,000 something officers. Imagine what 4,000 officers will do in Zamfara, Sokoto, and Kebbi. It will have prevented the emir who was just killed in Sokoto from being killed.
So Deji Adeyanju there, and before him, Daniel Buwala. And our guest commentators are still with us. And Daniel Buwala's central argument was essentially that the protests have come to naught because they had no leadership that would take their demands to the negotiating table. But Mr. Adeyanju felt that in a country as repressive as this, the protesters had achieved a lot by simply being able to go out to protest in the face of all, you know, the attempts to prevent them from doing so. I mean, what do you reckon, Donu?
I agree with Deji. Actually, to be honest with you, if I were an ordinary grassroots Nigerian, I'd be a lot more militant than they are. I'm actually surprised by how tame and how restrained they have been, given what they're going through. Like I said, even in a showcase city like Abuja, which is, you know, the sort of at the pinnacle of Nigerian life and sophistication, people are dropping with hunger. So as far as I'm concerned, the protests didn't go far enough. I was quite surprised by how mild they were. And I don't think the government should react so aggressively when people say, look, we're starving, we've had enough, we just want to come out and you know, show you how bad things are. Perhaps obviously they were afraid of escalation, but my view is that the protests were necessary and didn't go far enough.
Right, okay. I think I kind of reversed the order of the chat here. I apologize, Kenny. I think you missed a turn there. And I hope you're not sulking, sitting in that off-site. We can't hear. Sorry.
You're favoring those with ear in the studio.
No. That is definitely not what we do here. So let me come to you with profound apologies. Clearly, not much has changed since the cost of. With the cost of living, they demanded change in that cost of living, among other things. Would it have made sense for them to take advantage of the offer by President Tinubu for dialogue and to send representatives to negotiate on those demands with the government, just like we see, for instance, the labor unions doing? I mean, after protests, they send their leaders to sit down and hammer out terms and conditions with the government.
But you're very correct. The truth about it was that When some of us spoke against the protest, not because it wasn't the right of Nigerians to protest, Section 39 and Section 40 of the Constitution clearly gives you not only a right of expression, but a right of free assembly and association. So you have your right to protest. But it was clear that the protesters didn't have an organized leadership, and some had ulterior motives. Take, for example, my good friend, Ebun Adegboruwa, the SN, who is my neighbor in Lagos. Initially represented the Take It Back movement, and eventually saw that they tried to denigrate him, even though he had had a meeting with the police. Their leader was in America, who suddenly gave a representative called Adenuga to go with Ebun Adegboruwa. And there were limited places that they needed to protest. Who wouldn't want to, who's not feeling the hardship in this country? I pay band A electricity and I hardly get light. People are hungry, there's no doubt about it. So it would be insensitive for anybody to say that the protesters did not have a clear set reason to go and protest. But we have seen what happened during NSAS. And when we said that it was going to be hijacked, some kicked against it and said maybe we're being apologists of the government. But it's become very obvious that it was eventually hijacked. And not only was it hijacked, look at what happened in Kano, for example. The Silicon Valley was completely destroyed. This was something that was supposed to be inaugurated. Look at the people that died out of this protest. What would you say you have benefited from this protest? When the government was calling for a dialogue, it was clear that the government had been put under pressure and the government was ready to give in grounds. But by the time they went forward with this protest, there was no clear-cut agenda. And so what would we have said we gained from this protest? There was no gain from this protest. The government eventually had already increased the minimum wage to 70,000 naira. Some have said that the 70,000 naira is a drop in the ocean compared to the inflationary trends that we have had. But all this can be a reason for negotiations, just like you said, the NLC always do these negotiations and not having to allow hoodlums. Look at the woman that went to protest. She came back to see that her shop has been looted. How would you compensate such a woman who was only, protesting the hunger in the land, but then came back and saw that her shop had been looted? Okay. So it's the absolute truth about it that I don't think the protest actually achieved its aim.
Well, we're going to have to move on from this, otherwise we're not going to get to the other topics. I apologize. This is obviously not a classroom, so you don't need to raise your finger.
Well, I just wanted to say that
okay,
some of the hoodlums were sponsored by politicians.
Yeah, I think that point has been made stridently by a lot of the protesters themselves. But let's move on from there. And let me come to you, Baba Yusuf, because you are, of course, in addition to all the things that you've achieved as a policy strategist, a global investment expert, you're also a special economic zones expert, and you were the first MD and CEO of the first airport free trade zone in Nigeria. So having made that, let's turn to that still percolating story of the seizure of Nigerian planes by a Chinese company known as Zhongshan. Beyond the 3 presidential jets that were seized by the company in France, I think they returned one of them, we understand that they've seized another Nigerian plane in Quebec, Canada. So this story isn't going away, is it?
It's not, and from what we are hearing, by the way, for the records also, I'm a member of the World Free Trade Organization, so we have access to get other additional information, including for government to take. They are going after other assets in other jurisdictions, and that's a fact. Now, coming back to this issue, we discussed it earlier on why and how we are where we are today. And maybe my conclusion is, why we shouldn't disrupt processes due to political reasons or impulsive reasons, especially when it has to do with our international engagements, Charles. The Minister of Investment and Trade, stated during her performance, review for 1 year that President Tinubu has secured over $30 billion investment commitments. And what that has done, and I can say for myself, with all sense of authority, that funding partners of our organization have already flagged this issue with regards to some of our efforts to bring in FDI, particularly, I can tell you, so that the government will understand the repercussions of this. We have a $250 million funding we have been trying to bring in for the past 4 years. Now, the Dangote debacle and this has raised questions by the funding partners to send emails to us and have engagement to say what is going on. And what that will do is, first of all, our inflow for the last quarter of this year has been pended, Charles. Secondly, I know that our negotiations have to be reviewed because the risk is escalated with regards to goodwill, with regards to the position of Nigeria
as a result of this. Yeah.
So my call is we should be circumspect, and also how we react. When these planes were taken over by that company, we have discordant voices from government, including ministers. I advise when these kind of things happen, there should be a clearinghouse. There should be a coordinated response in a way and manner that we have our best foot forward going forward. With regards to the free zone, I don't know how the governor did what he did, but Section 1, sub 1 of the Nigerian Export Processing Zone Authority gives authority to Mr. President to declare free trade zone. And by extension, NEBSA is the one that can actually revoke licenses based on some steps that should be taken. And in line with our local laws should supersede even what you call the bilateral agreements we have with Chinese. But whatever it is, like I said, exit clauses are critical and penalty clauses are critical. With regards to litigation, I understand there were 2 times Nigeria was not represented in court, which is a very sad development with regards to how we are able to follow our litigations.
Indeed, and we appreciate your, obviously, expertise in this direction. Let me come to you, Donu, as briefly as you possibly can so that I can go to Kenny and we can wrap this section up. What sort of salutary lessons are there for the Nigerian government here, given that ferocious response by the Chinese and the fact that clearly the Chinese will go to extreme measures to protect their agreements?
Well, obviously it's bad news for the people who are always, as my friend here says, trying to bring investment in. I'm a little confused as to why a state government's quarrel with a foreign company becomes a national problem and a federal government problem. And I think the federal government should at least sanction that state government for dragging us all into this mess.
Yeah, good point. And that is an issue of part of the litigation, or at least the challenge that the Nigerian government is putting up, that this is a state affair. Why would you seize Nigerian government sort of property? But Kenny, as briefly as you can, please. Basically, this company, Zhongzhan, will not stop seizing Nigerian assets until the money they believe they are owed is paid back. And we know they've already seized Nigerian assets in the UK and France and now Canada. Briefly, your thoughts on that?
I think, just like what she said, there should have been no reason why a state government, if we say, even if we admit that the state government made a mistake, they should visit the scene on the federal government. But Ibikula and Musun have made it very clear that the Chinese company is a 419 company. And so I think by the time the other hearing comes up in court, all this will be corrected, like the P, I, and D. I don't think they deserve any of our assets from what, if we take what Ibikula and Musun said, the former governor of Ogun State. And it's sad that the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Attorney General might likely have been caught napping because they might not have had enough briefings. But they are putting their acts together from what we can see now to ensure that by the time they have the next hearing, all this will be put into place and the assets will be released.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, I mean, when you say 419, that just means fraudulent. I mean, that's
yes.
For an international audience, they need to know that essentially refers to fraud. But the point remains that the Chinese company would have made very convincing arguments in courts to have secured the court orders that allowed them to seize that sort of Nigerian government property. But stay with me, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Arise Prime Time. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our assessment of the week that was with our guest commentators. Stay with us. Welcome back to Arise Prime Time, where we offer perspectives on the news and talking points of the day. I'm Charles Anier-Golden. Now let's continue our look back at the week that was, going behind the headlines to explain the big news and issues of the past week with our top crop of guest commentators who are helping us to make sense of Nigeria's and the world's most profound political developments with their clear, accurate and stylish analysis. And with me in the studio are Donu Kogbara, an international multimedia journalist who once worked for the BBC in London. She currently has a column with Vanguard newspaper, presents a YouTube program called Donu's World, co-presents a podcast called Africa Here and Now, and writes for the European magazine called The Africa Report. Baba Yusuf, a policy strategist and group CEO of the Global Investment and Trade Company, who's also a special economic zones expert and was the first MD and CEO of the first airport free trade zone in Nigeria. And in our off-site studio, Kenny Okolugbo, who's a current affairs analyst, a political and communications consultant, and a former commissioner in Delta State. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. Now let's go abroad to the US, in fact, where Kamala Harris has promised a new way forward in American politics as she accepted the Democratic nomination for president. Addressing cheering supporters in Chicago, the vice president said there was a fleeting chance to move past division and bitterness, and she made an appeal to swing voters, promising tax cuts, more broader security, and protections for reproductive rights. Well, let's come straight away to our commentators. Let me come to you, Donu. Just a month ago, many people did not envisage this moment. America's lesser-known second in command now propelled into the starring role. Do you believe Kamala Harris can make history by becoming the first woman to be the president of the United States?
Well, let me first say that I am totally biased. I have always loved Kamala from the beginning. I love everything about her. And so I want to believe that she can win. There have been times when I've had my doubts, but the energy and sense of optimism that's infusing her campaign makes me think she stands a very, very high chance. Actually, you know, there's certain historical moments where we all remember where we were when these things happened. Like, I remember where I was when Mandela was released from jail. I remember where I was when Barack Obama, the first black man, I never thought I would see it in my lifetime. I remember where I was when Goodluck Jonathan, the first Niger Delta man to become president of Nigeria, when it was announced. These are hugely emotional moments. And I remember where I was when Joe Biden stepped down. And I'm really grateful to him for having the dignity and generosity to let go in old age and let a younger person bring some joy into his party.
Indeed. Baba Yusuf, I don't know if you heard her speech at the Democratic National Convention, but looking at the way she tackled the very divisive issue of the war in Gaza, she seemed to say that she supports Israel's right to defend itself, but she also said she wants an end to the war on Gaza and favors self-determination for the Palestinian people. Is that the sort of answer that'll please everybody or perhaps please nobody?
I think, by the way, I listened to Kamala's acceptance speech. Brilliant, by the way. It's a game-changing moment for the United States of America and a lesson to the emerging democracies. To first of all answer your question, I think she did the right messaging, if you like, and setting the tone for what her campaign narratives will be, and indeed possibly her promise in terms of foreign policy. They have gauged the situation. Of course, also, Charles, interestingly, she stylishly, sidestepped Joe Biden's position with regards to the fight in Gaza to show that possibly she's trying to bring a balance in her messaging. But more importantly for me is to take from what Donu mentioned, appreciating Joe Biden's stepping away. It also reflects the maturity of the democracy in the United States of America, which is not actually a favor, but actually a strategic move based on the influences of the power brokers within the Democratic Party to influence a very recalcitrant Joe Biden to step aside and create a sucker punch for Donald Trump. That changed the tone, and if you see the reaction of Donald Trump, which I believe they should go back to the strategy, not to be wavered by this, in their own messaging, in their own reactions, to take a position, because she has the momentum now.
Right.
But what is lacking in her own case and in Donald Trump's case is issues-based conversation with regards to homeland security, with regards to immigration, which I think will come out during the debates in the upcoming days.
Absolutely. I mean, that is what everyone is looking for. And that debate, of course, will be covered comprehensively here on Arise News. It will take place on September the 10th. But let me come to you, Kenny Okolugbo, because the polls suggest that Ms. Harris has taken the lead in this race, but Republicans have attacked her as too liberal, and there are fears about the economy and the U.S. border immigration crisis. These are issues that play to Donald Trump's strengths, so there is still a lot for her to overcome.
Yes, you know, I listened to that speech yesterday, and unlike what my colleagues out there with you said, I was quite disappointed. It was a speech of a lifetime. If you listen to the Obamas gave a better speech. She clearly wanted to disassociate herself from the policies of Biden. But by the time you did not talk about the border issue, you did not talk about Lincoln Riley, you didn't talk about all those who have been killed by those who have entered America illegally because of the open borders that you have operated. Yes, she doesn't want to agree that she was the borders I like the initial story she told of her mother, who was 19, that came into America and met her father. That was a beautiful story, and anybody could have been captivated by that story, and how she rose from becoming just a district attorney in San Francisco to becoming the attorney general and to becoming a United States senator. But she didn't tell us what she had in her policy. Dodo, you must agree with me that she talked about reducing tax for the middle class income earners, but didn't tell us how she was going to go about it. You know, we talked about inflation before in this studio, Charles, and I told you 25%, and you tried to doubt me. By the time the figures came out, 47% is on gasoline, 48% is on eggs in America. If you break it down to the fact that groceries are 22% and inflation is at 4.5%, they inherited inflation at 1.4%. So Kamala Harris has to talk to Americans what she wants to do, and not by just denigrating Trump. Yes, people might say that Trump can lie, but I think her speech was fact-checked yesterday, and she actually told a whole lot of lies. You shouldn't go the way Trump goes. If you want to beat Trump, you don't beat Trump by his own game. You have to tell Americans what your policies are. It was a speech, but it was a speech devoid of what she actually intended to do. I couldn't even pick up one, not even with the border. She said she was going to resubmit that same border bipartisan Congress approach that was kicked away by the House of Rep and by the Senate. Is that what she's going to bring back to the table instead of remaining in Mexico? I mean, that's not going to work with Americans.
Okay, well, let's just be very clear that that speech yesterday was not meant to be a speech that sets out in detail.
Thank you, Charles.
All the, the policy, things that she's going to deliver to the American people. What it did was that it was aimed at letting the world know a little bit more about Kamala Harris, what she stands for, and what her, broadly speaking, policy ideas are. Your thoughts before we move on, Dolu?
Well, I totally agree with you. The speech at the DNC was not meant to be a detailed policy analysis or party manifesto. Of course, the Obamas are very charismatic, so, and Oprah Winfrey, they're going to speak really well in their own rights. But the thing that makes me happiest about Biden stepping down and handing over to my girl Kamala is that it has triggered off a massive panic attack in Donald Trump. A titanic tantrum. The man is on the ropes, just wondering how he's going to deal with this new challenge, because it was all right with sleepy old Joe, but it's not going to be all right with Cam.
Yeah, indeed. A final word? Baba?
Oh, yes. As we proceed,
Very
I think
briefly.
for me, as a Nigerian and African, I will be very keenly listening to both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris with regards to what they have for Africa, what they have for us in their foreign policy, in their international trade and investment initiatives. And also, I will be very interested to hear what the policy statement will be for Kamala with regards to what is happening, Ukraine versus Russia,
Right.
China versus US.
Well, she's already said she's going to stand firmly with Ukraine. She made that very clear
She
in
did.
her speech. But let's move on to our final topic of the evening. And I shall come to you, Kenny, in the Offsite studio. And it is the issue of a new people's constitution for this country, looking at the problems that bedevil Nigeria at the moment: poverty, unemployment, insecurity, a cost of living crisis, etc. Do you agree or disagree with those who say that these are more important issues facing Nigeria today than a new constitution, and that those are the issues we should be focusing on?
You know, the Emeka Anyaoku-led patriots is you can't wish them away. That's a committee of Nigerians who you can't wish away at any point in time. But we have to also face realities. We can't be talking about a new constitution when we have a National Assembly that is actually going on a constitutional review. You have the Deputy Speaker who is leading that. I know they will say that that has happened year after year. We need a brand new constitution. But at the crossroad where we are right now, I believe we should rather inject those changes we want to inject through the National Assembly repositioning and review of the Constitution, rather than going to another constitutional conference. They had one in 2014, just like we have gone back to the Oronsaye reports. Why not we take what happened in 2014 and review that and take the merits of it and leave the demerits of it? Because it's going to be an exercise that is going to cost us a whole lot. Don't forget that saying that they should elect 3 people for each of the 3 senatorial districts. So what it means is that you're just going to elect 109 people, and you know how much that is going to cost in the 36 states of the Federation. And the cost of hosting them, the cost of hosting that conference, are you going to replace the senators who are 109? Is that what you're saying? Yes, Emeka Anyaoku is very respected, and I respect where they're coming from. And the fact that the president actually welcomed them tells you a whole lot that he takes them very seriously. But I am of the view that at this point in time, it's not a new constitution that we need. We need to put food on the table of Nigerians. Nigerians are actually hungry. We need to go back to the drawing board. We need to go to the farms. We need to create security for our farmers to start farming. We need to stop oil theft, just like National Assembly has started investigating what has happened in the oil industry. We need to understand why we should still queue for fuel, even when fuel is at 619 naira, going to 800 and something naira. These are the issues that should be uppermost on our mind now than a new constitution.
Well, we need to gallop ahead because I've just been told we've just got about 4 minutes left. So we need to be fairly pithy in our sort of discussion here. Let me come to you, Donu, because, and just correct something very briefly that Kenny point that he made, which is I don't think the Patriots, because we've had them here in the studio, are insisting that there must be another big sort of, committee, a group of people set up, to discuss this. They're saying that there needs to be action taken. And if that action requires dusting off the 2014 confab report and going through it and trying to use it, then that's what they think ought to be done, but they want action. What do you think?
Well, of course, I agree with them. Anything Anyaoku says tends to rhyme well with me. And I remember being a member of the original Petroleum Industry Bill Committee, the committee that drafted the original PIB. And I remember saying right at the beginning, we started in, I think it was 2001. I remember saying right at the beginning, any which way you arrange and rearrange the words and the laws, nothing will count if you're not sincere and if you're not actually going to implement these things properly. So if you like, you can bring 25 new constitutions. They can include restructuring in theory. They can include banishing oil theft in theory. But if you're not sincere, it's not going to work. So I'm not a great fan of all this talk about, there's too much talk, too little action. So, that's just my view, is that
okay.
The authorities are not sincere about change. So it doesn't matter how you coin it on paper.
I think a lot of people would agree with you. Baba Yusuf, we've got less than 90 seconds, as briefly as you can. Where do you see this latest push for fundamental constitutional reform going? Or is it going to be stuck in the mud like all the other previous attempts?
I totally align with the call for the overhaul of the Constitution. I believe it's a critical success factor to the enduring unity and progress of this country, because there are key provisos that will be included in that overhaul. The templates proposed by the Anyoku Committee is very good. What I'm saying is we should have focus on the current economic realities, but let it be part of an overarching strategy within the roadmap of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, so that down the line we'll be addressing this. There's a lot of hue and cry about disunity, about lack of equity, and we'll continue pushing it away. It will be a combustible issue in the mid to long term.
Gentlemen and lady, I want to thank you very much indeed for an incredibly illuminating conversation. Baba Yusuf and Donu Kogbara and Kenny Okolugbo. Sorry, we don't have time to go into all the great things that you've done, but I want to thank you especially for being here this evening. That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again next week. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.